Welcome to Chapter 8, Human Populations. This chapter actually starts off with a case study about China's two-child policy, but it started actually in 1979 as a one-child policy. They did that because they were looking at a huge population that they weren't going to be able to feed or have enough jobs for. So most of the fertile farming land had been exhausted, and they started to reinforce this rule by rewards and punishment. So if you stayed at one child, you were rewarded with government help and better government jobs. If you were a farmer and you had more children, that was acceptable as long as your farm was profitable. There are some positives and negatives that actually came from this policy. Some of the positives are that the population stayed at a size that the country was able to feed and be able to have jobs for. There was less environmental damage and, again, enough jobs for the population. In the environmental science, we have a lot of gray areas with things not always being good or bad, kind of falling somewhere in the middle. So from a human rights perspective, this policy was frowned upon, but at the same time, at a societal or environmental perspective, it saved a lot of resources as well as a lot of individuals from starvation. So some of the negatives that came along with this was China has a male preference with society, and that's a cultural thing. Sometimes couples in rural areas would actually abandon or kill their baby girls to try for a boy, because the tradition was so strong with male preference to carry on family name and support the family as they aged. We were seeing a high amount of orphanages with abandoned females. Because of this, the family or the population was so heavy on the male side, so men had actually difficulty trying to find a wife. There was also not enough young people to support the aging population in terms of the social security factors. So we face this issue in other aging populations like our own and in Europe. As a result, the declining population and the need for a balance with social security. So China actually put a two-child policy in place then in 2015 to try to balance this out a little bit further. Make sure you know these charts. In the next 10 years, India is actually going to become the most populous country. India's growth is stable. It's still growing, but it's slowing down. They'll face some serious issues with their population size actually in the future. Also know the population is a J curve, so it's exponential growth. There's a little bump right here during the Black Death in the Middle Ages, and then we see a massive population growth in the last 200 years due to the Industrial Revolution. So population growth is limited by the available resources in space, and these resources have a finite amount. So as we have increased resources, we start to see population growth increase. When resources drop, we see an increase in unequal distribution of those resources, so more towards the wealthy than the poor or other things. And this leads to an increase of mortality and a decrease in population growth below carrying capacity, actually. Know that Sub-Saharan Africa has the highest population growth. Don't write just Africa on an AP test because actually there are places in Africa that are not going through rapid growth, so you have to write Sub-Saharan. Know the current world growth rate is 1.2%, and that doubles in 58 years, so it shows exponential growth. To calculate population doubling time, we use the rule of 70. And this rule takes 70 and divides it by the growth rate. So 70 divided by 1.2 gives you roughly 58 years for the Earth's doubling time. During the Industrial Revolution, we saw an increase in technology and improved medicine and sanitation, which led to a decrease in infant mortality rates. Because of this, there was a population growth, which for parents, a high birth rate meant more children to support them in age, and society had a greater pool of labor and factory workers. But Thomas Malthus, the British economist, he had a different view on this. He argued that unless population growth was controlled by laws or social structures, the number of people would outgrow the available food supply. So he believed the Earth did have a carrying capacity and that we should limit the global human population. Biologist Paul Ehrlich is a neo-Malthusian because he actually warns as well that the population is growing faster than our ability to protect or produce food. And his theory hasn't played out fully, hasn't materialized due to our ability to use technology to increase food production, but we have seen parts of, actually both of their theories play out with more population. We see a little bit more disease, more conflict, more famine, due to some of the lack of food. No IPAT, this is the impact of the population on the environment, and it's calculated by the population size times the affluence times technology. So at the beginning of the year, we talked a lot about how typically rich countries also have more technology, which leads to a greater impact on the environment. The US has a high IPAT, even though we're the third most populated nation, but we actually have more affluence and more technology. So therefore, our impact is a lot higher. You should know the top 5 most populous nations in order. China right now is sitting at number 1, India, the US, then Indonesia, and then Brazil. You also should know that Southeast Asia has the highest population density, so amount of people in that space. Again, you cannot just write Asia. There are many parts of Asia that are not on high population density. India, Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian countries are actually extremely densely populated. You should understand the shape and the growth rate structure diagrams and what they mean. We see that diagrams are split into 3 distinct colors, which separate different age groups, the 0 to 14 being pre-reproductive years, 15 to 45 are those people who are able to reproduce and have children, and then individuals that are between 46 and 100 years of age, which would be more of that post-reproductive years. We also look at the shape. Triangular diagram shows a rapid increase in population with the majority of individuals in the pre and the reproductive age, so therefore there's going to be a lot more babies to come in the future. We also then look at the stable population. So with the stable one, a population diagram has straighter sides on either side. And then we look at a decreasing population, less individuals in the pre-reproductive years, so we're going to see less children than in the future generations. Understand the shape and the growth rate of those diagrams and be able to describe kind of what's going on. We see in Canada and in the US that there's actually a large post-World War II baby boom of individuals in their 50s and 60s. So right in this age is the children that were born of soldiers that came home from war. And right now they're in their 50s and 60s. So we see that boom is now aging, and that population is going to become old soon. And unfortunately, we don't have a big population below that to start taking care of their needs as that population grows. So we actually call that a grain population. China, the US, Europe are experiencing a grain population as a lot of their population is getting older, and it's leading to less workers that are available to support the Social Security, healthcare needs of the elderly. So China's grain population is not from the baby boomers in their case, but it's actually from the one-child policy. In our country and in some of the European countries, it's more from the baby boom. Okay, so how do we keep a population stable? Well, to keep a population stable, it occurs when the fertility rate is at a replacement level. So you and your partner, basically, that's 2 of you, you're gonna have enough kids to replace yourself. So you're gonna have 2 kids, no more, no less, and that's gonna keep a stable population because you're just replacing individuals in and out of the population. So when we look at total fertility rate, that's the number of children a woman is actually going to be able to have. It's affected by the age at which females start having kids, their education and their educational opportunities, family planning, things like government acts and policies that might be implemented in that particular country. All of those factors will play a role in the fertility rate of a woman. So when we look at fertility rate, again, affected by all those things, we see that in developed countries like the US and Europe, the replacement fertility rate is around 2.1 kids. The 0.1 accounts for the fact that not all kids are going to live to reproductive age. The 2 accounts for the replacement of the female and the male that produce the kids. Again, the 0.1 accounts for the death. So in developing countries, we see a higher replacement fertility because there's a higher rate of child mortality or a larger number of children not reaching that reproductive age. And this might occur due to the fact that we have bacterial infections, diseases like malaria, where they don't have as many vaccines in developing countries. All those factors could play a role in why infants won't live. So if you take a look at this chart up here, this chart shows the total fertility rate of different countries. So in Africa, women have on average of 4.7 children. Europe is actually shrinking because they're below the replacement value of 2. So in Europe, we're seeing a replacement of 1.4. In America, we are also below the replacement, but we have more immigration in this country. And with immigration, that brings other individuals that have different replacement variables. So they might follow their prior country's replacement rates, and that's causing our population to continue to increase, even though we're seeing a low replacement. Again, sub-Saharan Africa is rapidly growing. You need to know the demographic transition charts. This is right down here. You've probably seen these before in your human geo class. Each stage and what is happening at each stage is really important. This chart shows the transition from high to low birth rate and death rates as a country starts to develop. So we have the pre-industrial stage. At this point, we have birth and death rates that are both going to be high. So people have a lot of kids because they're expecting a lot of them to die. The survival rate and accident rate are actually really high, and a lot more disease as well. So we don't have a growing population. There are a few places in this stage currently, but really they're more like villages or tribal areas and forested populations like the Amazon. Transitional stage. In some countries, this stage is just starting. The death rate drops due to better healthcare and better access to food and vaccines, but people are still having a lot of kids because they didn't realize, and they aren't realizing, that they have a little bit better survival rate. The industrial stage, we start to see once we realize that kids are surviving and the death rate has dropped, then people start to realize they don't need to have 7 kids in order to have 2 survive to adulthood, and we see the birth rate drop. Also, usually we see girls are getting better access to education, which lowers fertility rates, and access to birth control is higher, so birth rate drops. The post-industrial, we see birth rates and death rates are both really low. The United States and Europe are in this as well. Some books in the human geo classes actually have a 5th stage, which is really where Europe is. And this is where the death rate is actually higher than the birth rate. So you actually have a shrinking population. In AP Environmental, we only do the 4 stages. We don't do the 5th one. So that's something that you should remember. Again, developing countries have a higher infant mortality rates, more kids in the workforce. So it's an advantage to have more kids as it brings more hands to work on the farm and more individuals to work in the factory. But at some point you are going to have to feed those kids later as well. So this becomes a rut of individuals not receiving education as well because these kids are forced into working before being educated. Population momentum. It's going to actually take as you hit the post-industrial area on that chart, you have 0% growth rate. Well, there's still a population behind you of individuals in that industrial portion that are at reproductive age and will have more kids. So the population isn't technically at 0 for at least another generation. So it's going to take some time for that population rate to truly drop to 0%. Demographic fatigue is when the government basically can't handle how many people are in the country and they run out of food, schools, services, and jobs. So we start to see a fatigue in that particular country and big problems. You should know how HIV and AIDS has affected Africa and how that has led to many orphaned children and lower income and food availability in that country. Know the figures and terms that go along with this one. It talks about the reproductive window for women. The first menstrual cycle all the way to menopause is when a woman is able to potentially reproduce and have kids, but that doesn't mean that they will. This process can be delayed through many different ways. So delay of childbirth, focus on the fact that most women are going to continue on with their education, go to college, maybe want to start a job, get stable in the job, and then they're going to delay and have kids later on in age. Or maybe the use of contraception is going to spread out the birth of children, so they're not having them back to back to back. So we do see this in more developed countries. Women are going to space their pregnancies out. They're going to have children later on in age because they're looking to have that career or finish up their education. Knowing how and ways to reduce population growth is super important. The number one way to reduce population growth in this country is education. Not birth control, not education about birth control, not family planning, but getting girls in school, reading, writing, and math is actually the biggest way to reduce population growth. The second is infant mortality. If a family knows their children are going to live, then they're not going to have as many children. If they expect some of them to die, they're going to actually have more children to make sure some make it to adult age. Equality for women and freedom equals lower fertility rates because education allows women to marry later, earn their own money, which lowers the total fertility rate. If you have an education and a job, you don't have to marry for survival. So girls in poorer countries are actually married off at around 15 or 16 because their families can't afford to feed them anymore. And they marry them off, and they do it because they need basically to eat. If you get married young without access to birth control or without certain freedoms, you're going to start having children at a young age, and that typically then results in more pregnancies over your lifetime. So we have a huge amount of AP questions that typically fall in this realm. So again, the number one way to reduce population growth is the education of women. Quality of life in this country is based on life expectancy and infant mortality rate. So we say that a country has a certain quality of life. We are taking into account the life expectancy and your infant mortality. Understand what biocapacity is. Make sure you have an understanding of that topic. And that goes along with your basically your ecological footprint as well. And then we are done with this chapter.